Hi everyone. So, I may have to do two of these if I forget to mention a few things about shooting an elephant. But hopefully I can get through all of it uh, without too much, without too much pain. Um, all right, so this is going to be the focus for the final paper. The assignment is going to be very similar, although I will give several different prompts. So if you don't want to write that paper, you'll have at least an option for analysis. I will say this, the second option will be quite a bit more complex because it's going to be dealing with a contemporary, well, relatively contemporary philosopher named Richard Rorty in his essay about Orwell, which is, I don't think it's that tricky, but it's because I've read Rorty a lot and philosophy in general, so the language that he's using is not. I may be misjudging how difficult it is. So if that's not uh, uh, interesting to you, no problem. Just do the other one. So in shooting an elephant, I wanted to mention that there's a certain irony with Orwell in general because he's a household name, and he used to do radio broadcasts for BBC. Like he was a very fairly well known public intellectual, and yet we don't have a single recording of his voice or any film of him like moving around. So it's just a certain irony considering that Orwellian has become part of uh, the English language, just as Big Brother, Newspeak, and all of these other terms that he coined, Cold War, as I mentioned, and yet we don't know what his voice sounded like. So it's interesting how you can be that famous and still, and in an era when film and radio recording would have been a possibility. Just to note, Orwellian, if you ever hear it used, it can describe both the like living inside of an Orwellian nightmare, like an Orwellian government, but it can also describe from the outside. Okay, so it can be used in both contexts. Um, as I mentioned the other day, Orwell, then his name was Eric Blair. He George Orwell, as I mentioned, is a pen name. Um, when he was young, he was a police officer in Burma, which is now Myanmar. His father actually was I believe he was in the police force as well. And so this would have been, like following your father's footsteps and all of that. And so this wouldn't have been out of place. And it's interesting to remember that Orwell was born in India. And so he was born in this region. And so I think that there were a lot of sympathies that he had for the people around him because this would have been childhood memories as well. And it's the same with and I'll mention him. I think I mentioned him the other day. Rudyard Kipling, another British author, preceding Orwell quite a bit, but he was born in India as well and wrote a lot about the region. He's often, I think, mislabeled as a jingoist, but anyway. So all that said, Orwell, and I have to put this out there, okay? I've read him extensively. He was not a racist, okay? That label gets thrown around way too commonly nowadays, to the point where I think it has actually lost its meaning. Everything's racist, Orwell, not a racist. I think that far more than Kipling, he was much more sympathetic and much more critical of British imperialism. And if you go and read him, it's right there on the page. He's not in favor of what British imperialism became. And I think, kind of like Kipling, he could understand why it was implemented and why some people saw it as potentially beneficial. But for the most part, he's very critical of it, while still being patriotic to Britain. Now, you can see this because, for example, when Orwell was living in Burma, he did learn the language and he learned several subdialects, which, if you didn't care, right, if you were just there for a job, to look over, and make money and lord this over these people, you would not learn the language. There's no point, okay? So he cared enough, right, about the region to actually look that up. I don't have the book in front of me. I do have another by the same author, but there's a British author named Christopher Hitchens who wrote a very good book called Why Orwell Matters, and he discusses in that book, parts of Orwell's biography and trying to tease out, I think, a more rounded picture of who George Orwell was as a person, because very often, he's so almost like too big, right? Because of 1984 and Animal Farm and everything. And he's often like mythologized. And so what's interesting is that both political sides, the political left and political right, both criticize Orwell while still claiming him as one of their own. So he's a very interesting figure to me. So I think that Orwell, the man, the person, was really caught in a tug of war of conscience, just as we see the speaker in this story. And the story is it's nonfiction, okay? So this is an essay. This is not a short story. So this is not fiction, okay? It's nonfiction. Funny distinction. So the plot, as we discussed in A Hanging, is very simple. It's pretty much the title. Okay, shooting an elephant. That's what the story is about. Just as A Hanging is about hanging that prisoner. What you'll note throughout is that the speaker, in the way he describes his situation, is powerful but powerless. There's a definite irony that Orwell is using in this essay. And if you look right there on the first line, oops. This might be in the other. Oops, I brought the wrong book down. So I'm going to have to pause this and run and get the book. Magically back. And you'll notice what's really hard about doing these videos, especially with any pause, and this is why I respect some YouTube videos for people who do that as a job, because they have to like get back into position relatively close to where they pushed pause. So when you see those little jumps in a video, anyway, as he says in Shooting Elephant, in Moulmein in Lower Burma, I was hated by large numbers of people. The only time in my life that I have been important enough for this to happen to me. He starts off ironic, okay? Now, why is that irony? Because if you're important, normally we would see that, if you're important, usually that's a positive thing. We don't hate those people that are important, and so he just starts it off right away. So he's powerful, but you'll see powerless. So he's signaling right there in the first sentence, like this is going to be, there's going to be a lot of irony happening in this. Now, in that sense of importance, right, we have to think about his role as a police officer and the duty that comes with that, okay? What is duty, okay? Duty does not directly come from Greek, but if you go and read, if I've interested you enough to maybe look at a little bit of philosophy, Immanuel Kant, I mentioned him in the last set of lectures. He had a set of philosophy called the deontological philosophy, which comes from the Greek deon, and deon means deon, deontos, that which is binding, needful, right, or proper, things needful or proper, or duty. Okay, So, incidentally, if you ever want to learn classical Greek, okay, I strongly recommend getting the Liddell and Scott dictionary because it is very comprehensive. There's no English to Greek in this, by the way. It's just all Greek, but it's really 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 good. So very very thorough. So anyway, it's a hard language. So when we have a strong sense of duty, right? My duty is I am bound to, right, what is good and proper, right? That comes from having a strong sense of, moral correctness, right? To be, to know what your path is, okay? Now, what you'll notice in this, that the speaker is doing his duty, right, to pacify this elephant, to kill it, but in doing so, he knows that it's wrong. So if you're doing your duty, but you know that it's wrong, or you don't want to do it, right, you can see that this is going to create a sense of confusion. Your psychology is going to get all twisted, right? And this is something that we see time and time again. You can look to the excuses made by, I think I mentioned this in one of the last lectures, the excuses made by guards in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. I was just doing my duty. I was just following orders. They told me what to do. I didn't, you see, and so most of them knew what they were doing was wrong, right? There's no way you could see that and just think, well, whatever. There's no human way that that's possible. So they just kind of close their eyes to it and close their souls in that sense. Okay, so he is doing his duty, and I'm not paralleling this. I'm not paralleling this speaker to anything remotely like that. But it's just that sense of duty. Okay. In paragraph 2, he talks about hating imperialism, but at the same time hating the Burmese because they're constantly not attacking the British, but they're poking, right? Because their form of protest, right, can't take the shape of outright attacks, but they're very subtle. Where does he talk about that? As for the job I was doing, I hated it more bitterly than I can perhaps make clear. In a job like that, you see the dirty work of empire at close quarters. The wretched prisoners huddling in the stinking cages of the lockups, the gray, cowed faces of the long-term convicts, the scarred buttocks of the men who had been flogged with bamboos. All of these oppressed me with an intolerable sense of guilt. But I could get nothing into perspective. I was young and ill-educated, and I'd had to think out my problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. All I knew was that I was stuck between my hatred of the empire I served and my rage against the evil-spirited little beasts who tried to make my job impossible. With one part of my mind, I thought of the British Raj as an unbreakable tyranny, as something clamped down in secula seculorum upon the will of prostrate peoples. With another part, I thought that the greatest joy in the world would be to drive a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts. So you see that he can't get anything into perspective. He talks about himself as young and ill-educated. And he couldn't think clearly. Why? Because, and we'll see more clearly in this essay, that the language itself has been corrupted, right? And so therefore, when the language is corrupted through euphemism, etc., you can't get your brain around a certain concept, right? To play a little bit with this, if I hopefully I'm not repeating myself here, and I'm modifying this a little bit from what the original intention was, because a lot of people will misquote this and misuse it. but I'm misquoting it intentionally here. And the Austrian philosopher, you'll remember this from 119 if you had it with me. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said, die Grenze meiner, die Grenze meiner Sprache bedeuten die Grenze meinem Welt, which means the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And so when we don't have a word or concept, right, to describe something, it's hard to get your mind mentally around it. That's the power that language has. And this is something that Orwell was very, very sensitive to and very, very much aware of. And you can see it almost throughout, especially in 1984 in Animal Farm, but also in early on in these early essays. He can get nothing in perspective, has to think in solitude. But he says this, and this is an interesting line: the British Raj, that would be the British imperial rule in India and the region, like Myanmar. He said it's better than the ones that will replace it. So he understands that Britain will eventually, leave, be kicked out, whatever. But that there's always going to be some other Raj or power that comes in. Now, it's not necessarily, it doesn't even have to be a foreign power. It could just be corrupt internal power. Okay. And there's an interesting part in paragraph 4 where he says, and I'm using paragraph 4 instead of page numbers because it's easier to count. In paragraph 4, he says, the closer you get to something in the East, meaning out there, the less clear it becomes, which is counterintuitive. So you see that he's layering these ironies all throughout this essay. Now, what happens in the story is that he hears that this elephant has gone crazy, right? And so elephants over there would be basically farm animals. They would be, expensive farm machinery. Okay, they'd be used to move trees and haul heavy things, etc. Now it's gone crazy because it's in a state of must, and you can see here. Sometimes it's spelled this way, like we would spell, like you must go to the store. Sometimes it's spelled with an H at the end. It's the same thing either way. It's just it's mating season for the elephant, and male elephants, their brains get flooded with about 1,000 times more of a certain chemical, I don't remember which one it is, that makes them incredibly lusty, but also incredibly violent. Like, they become rage machines, okay? And so they have to act, usually they're chained when must is coming upon them. The mahouts or the owners will usually chain them because they're unpredictable. They're very, very dangerous. And if you've ever been near an elephant, dear gods, they are beautiful but terrifying, right? They're so big. It's hard to conceptualize, and they're beautiful. I love elephants. But now he gets his rifle, right? He goes off on his horse to find the elephant. Can't find it for a while. Sees the destruction. He sees that it's killed a guy, and we'll come back to that in a bit. And it's a really lovely image. When he first sees the elephant, it's just standing there, picking up grass and beating. So it's just a beautiful image where this elephant, it doesn't want to eat the dirt. Obviously, it just wants the delicious grass. So it's ripping these clods of grass out and beating the dirt with its trunk on its knees. It's beating the dirt off of the grass. It's just a lovely image. And it's so serene, right? Once again, we have this kind of almost structural irony where elephant has killed, elephant has destroyed, elephant is dangerous, and now it's doing nothing. In fact, he describes the elephant as grandmotherly, that grandmotherly air that elephants have, as he describes it. Now, that's a personification. You have to be really conscious of the language that Orwell's using in here because it's really subtle. It's very easy to miss. Now, he doesn't want to shoot it. He clearly says this, right? But why does he? Remember, there's a big group of people. They see him, they know he's a police officer, and they know something's about to happen. You know, this is a poor area. These people, there's no cinema, there's no cell phone, there's nothing else to do, and so they follow him out because something's going to happen, right? And he says, I don't want to shoot the elephant. I don't want to shoot it. I don't want to shoot it. And he says, I must shoot it. Why? Because of peer pressure. Now, once again, that's ironic. Okay? Why? He's supposed to be in charge. He's the police officer. He's the he's the guy who's in charge of this, right? But somehow, because he doesn't have any sense of duty, right? He doesn't have a moral compass in that sense. He says, I know I shouldn't shoot this elephant. Okay, I'm going to shoot it. And it's peer pressure. Even though, ironically, they're not peers, right? He has, in the hierarchy, much more power over this group. Another thing to notice is that, and I think I forgot to mention this, is that there is a hierarchy inside of this system, okay? He talks about several Indians who have been imported more or less to work, okay? And so you'd have the Burmese, the Indians, and then the British. So it's creating this hierarchy, okay? So there's hierarchies within hierarchies being created here. And what that does, it creates power relations, okay, between these groups. So even though he's supposed to be on top, right, he is through peer pressure, right? And I think that does two things, right? It shows, first of all, that the speaker is confused, has no sense of duty, etc. But I do also think, as a subtext, that it shows a certain sympathy, right? It shows a certain solidarity. Remember, he says that it makes him feel incredibly guilty. He hates it, but at the same time, it drives me nuts. There's a lot of contradictory stuff going on here. So I don't want you to get confused. It's just it's there in the text. Another thing I want you to pay attention to as you're reading through this is this will help you to probably figure out the basis for your final paper, okay? Because once again, you're going to be looking at language use, euphemism, how is it functioning in this text, okay? Just like in a hanging, but this is a much more complex paper, okay? Because it's a much more complex essay. Compare the descriptions that he uses when describing the elephant and the Dravidian, the guy who died, okay? I think it's also telling that Orwell uses, instead of just saying the Indian, he calls him a Dravidian. And a Dravidian would be somebody from like southern India. So once again, he's aware of and knows these distinctions, whereas I don't think most British people would. The elephant is often personified. So personification of an elephant, right? Now, why is that important? Well, human beings, first of all, we personify kind of automatically, right? If a storm blows through and, you barely survived because you were caught out in it and you said, that storm nearly killed me, or that storm was trying to kill me, right? That moment of saying trying to, right? The storm wasn't trying to do anything. It was just a storm, right? It's just a force of nature. So we personify things all the time. It's just kind of a trick that our brains do. But in this story, or in this essay, right, we have to take that as some sort of intended function of the story. So notice when the elephant is personified, and the Dravidian is very often described in non-human terms. Okay. At one point, when he's describing maybe I'll come back to that, when he's describing what the Dravidian looked like, right, when he finds him in the mud, that's a really telling part of the essay. Um, for example, he's described as crucified. His arms are stretched, spread out. When you see crucifixion, right, the automatic association is Jesus, right? You can't. It's unavoidable, unavoidable. Could be Jesus, but I want you to think of this contextually. Okay, so you've got the Indian, right, this Dravidian, who has been crucified. Now, does Jesus fit with kind of where I've been leaning the interpretation of this essay? Right? Is this a savior figure? Probably not. Now, I've seen people actually try to write on this, some successfully, but it requires several extra layers of ironic thesis building. So, in a more direct interpretation, I would say that we can think of it as a form of punishment, right? Because who crucified Jesus? The Romans, right? And the Romans were quite famous for crucifixions. They didn't invent it, but they definitely perfected it. And why is that? It was actually not all that common a punishment because it was so painful, because it was like the worst way to die. And there were some studies done on the just how crucifixion works, and it was used even with the Romans as a last resort. Right? This is public punishment as major deterrent. Okay. Now the Roman Empire was very vast, just as the British Empire, very vast, and so like when Spartacus had the slave uprising in the Roman times, right? And they were fighting the Roman Empire, and it was really like interesting historical moment, because all of a sudden you've got these gladiators who were slaves, right, freeing other slaves, and then they created this army that actually was pretty successful at first. They would never have they would never have won. The Roman Empire, I mean, it was a professional army. Like, this wasn't just these were trained soldiers, and they would not have lasted very long. But when they finally defeated the slave army, they crucified them for kilometers, and all the roads leading into Rome. And so as visitors would come in, you would think, I am not going to mess with Rome ever, because I don't want this. But anyway, so it was deemed the most painful way to die, because when you would drive the nails, and the nails would be driven through the wrist here, not through the hand would tear out. So you drive the nail through here because there's the ulnar nerve sits right in there. It's incredibly painful. And then your legs were usually pinned up underneath you, and then a spike would be driven through sometimes the heels, but all the nerves in your feet, very painful. So you couldn't ever distribute your weight because it was all hanging on your upper body. So basically what happens is your muscles start to cramp, and eventually you die of asphyxiation, right? And it can take upwards of like 2 days, and I won't go any further because it gets really gruesome. But let's just say, not pleasant. Anyway, so I think that's my reading, is that it's a callback or a parallel to something like the Roman Empire. And to be fair, the Romans did conquer a lot, but they were usually fairly non-contact. Basically, their rules were, don't break the rules, like to a conquered peoples. Don't follow our laws, pay your taxes. And pretty much, they'd leave you alone. Sometimes they would even let the conquered peoples keep their own gods, So it was just mostly it was pay taxes. So another thing that you'll see in here, he keeps calling the Dravidian a coolie. And this word is interesting because, first of all, it's definitely racist language. In fact, the Chinese railroad workers who were brought into the U.S., and that's a whole other crazy history, but they were often referred to as coolies. This word, excuse me, this word is very, very old. And it shows up in some unrelated languages. So, like in Hindi, the word coolie means slave. In Chinese, they have a word kule, which means hard laborer, slave. In Urdu and Turkish, they have kul, which means slave. Okay, so for this word to show up in these unrelated languages means that at its root, at its etymological root, it's a very, very old word. Now, why? Well, I hate to break it to you, but slavery is a very, very old human universal institution. Every culture, up until the last couple of centuries, every culture practiced some form of it to some degree, and it extends back into human history. This is not some sort of new thing, and it was it's ancient. It's ancient, and you can see that just in the etymology of this word. So this is an old human practice, unfortunately. Now, these dehumanizing words, like coolie, right, are a type of euphemism. Okay, so racist words, right, can be a type of euphemism as well, where the speaker may just be referring to him as a coolie without necessarily thinking, oh, that's a dehumanizing phrase, right? And when I used to teach this, a variation of this in Korea, this was all I would always kind of segue into this part. That was only when I lived in Korea that I realized where the word gook comes from. Now, gook is a racist word that you would use against Asians. I say it here self-consciously because I don't like saying that word. But just, it's true. And I realized where it came from because it comes from the Korean language itself. And there's a certain irony to this because it came to refer to any Asian person. And what happened was American soldiers during the Korean War who would be stationed with and working with Korean soldiers would have heard them use the terms like Hanguk, I've written out here, Hanguk, Yongguk, Miguk, Chongguk, Waeguk. So that gook part of the word in the original Korean, they would have just clipped that out and then used that to describe probably the Korean soldiers, right? So by the time you get to Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, the soldiers there used the term to refer to the Vietnamese, okay? And Hanguk just means Korean. Yongguk would be English person. Miguk would be American. Chongguk would be Chinese. Waegukin just means foreigner. Okay, so it took this part of an Asian language, clipped part of it out, and then started to use it as a racist term. So, yeah. But that is a dehumanizing word. To refer to somebody with a racist or racial epithet is to effectively dehumanize them because, right, you're not seeing them as person, you're seeing them as separate category, okay? So that's kind of how racist language works by dehumanization. It creates what we would say an other. It others somebody else, okay? So some of the euphemisms that you'll see going forward, the personification of the elephant, describing it like a machine as well. It's not a machine. Description of shooting the elephant is like a horror scene. Like he's shooting the thing in the mouth. It's as somebody who adores elephants, it's awful to think about. Any of the racist language, I forgot to list it here, but the description of the Dravidian after he's been killed, right? He's described as his skin has been peeled off like a rabbit. Um, Devilish. Even though he's describing other dead bodies, um, he says that all dead bodies look devilish. So that's another dehumanizing term. Any dehumanizing descriptions outside of that, there are other descriptions, such as the sea of yellow faces behind him. That could be seen as either just an image, a harmless image, or it could be seen as racist. Some of the metaphors in paragraph 7. Okay, now those would be magic tricks, right? Conjurer. He's talking about the magical rifle. He's talking about a posing, hollow posing, dummy, conventionalized figure of a sahib. So those are metaphors that are you could see as euphemistic. Okay, remember back with Politics in the English Language, he talks about style as a potential euphemism. So if you can find anything in the style here, right, and I'll try to address this here in a moment, that's also a potential euphemism. I don't know why this little... I don't know how to get rid of it either. Like, I can move this thing, but I can never move this thing. It always just sticks. Anyway, what it's covering up here says who is controlling language and who is controlling thought. Okay, because remember, if you go back to Politics in the English Language, he says quite specifically, it got cut out. But if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. And the great enemy of clear... This is all in the same paragraph. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. Now think back to that idea of duty, right? When you have a clear purpose, when you have a clear duty, that's a sincere calling, right? You can state clearly, this is what I intend to do. This is my job. This is my role. These are my morals, right? But if you can't express that, right? If your language is clouded, if your intentions aren't clear even to you, right? That's insincere. Orwell says when there's a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, so like I say I'm going to do this, but I don't have that in mind or that intention. One turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish spurting out ink. Okay? Nice image to end that. Another thing to think about for this essay, you could parallel it to something like the myth of St. George and the dragon. And that would be, St. George rides in, kills the dragon, saves the day. Because notice, now St. George, right, was called upon by God, right, to do this. I mean, it was a holy mission. In Shooting an Elephant, the hero, right, the speaker, he has his weapon, right, rides in on a horse. There's the beast to slay. It's not even acting aggressively right now. He shoots it. He knows that he shouldn't. He doesn't want to do it, but the peer pressure, right, influences him. He has no sense of duty, no moral, no God's given action. He even fails to kill it at first. It dies later, and he leaves before it dies, right? He doesn't even see the task through to the end. So he does not save the day, so to speak. That could be an ironic reading of this tale. I think the parallel is strong enough to do that. So one central irony to note for the essay, and I'll end this shortly, is that imperialism, through language and physical coercion, right, both. It's not just, I'm going to beat you if you don't do it, right? It has to be done through language, okay? Remember, I mentioned this in one of the other lectures, but during Japan's colonial occupation of Korea, like I said, they made Korean illegal. Like it was illegal to write it, speak it, think it. Okay? And so when you've taken away somebody's language, taken away somebody's words for something, think back to what we discussed with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. You have taken away their ability to rationalize it, okay? Their ability to think it. And once you do that, you are now controlling the last free part of the person, right? I can put you, right, in a cage. I can lock you up as a person, but your mind is still free. But when I've started to control your language and what you are able to think or how you're able to think, right, now I've got you. That's the true cage, okay? So it's not just physical coercion, it's through the language, control of language. It traps both the ruler and the ruled, okay? So it's not, so the speaker in this, as an emblem of the empire, is kind of more trapped than anybody, right? Because he's supposed to have power but doesn't, supposed to have a duty, doesn't, supposed to be the moral, have the moral high ground, doesn't, right? Is a police officer that doesn't protect the community. And that's because imperialism, through the corruption of language, traps everybody within. And just one little, just to kind of show you this, I think I mentioned it earlier, a close reading irony. When he says the British Raj clamped down in Saecula Saeculorum, that means forever and ever. Okay, it's a Latin phrase that's supposed to describe God's grace and divinity, right, going on forever and ever and ever. Here, it's ironically describing a potential eternity of servitude, right? So instead of something like God's grace, right, we have something of the opposite, right? A kind of horrible servitude, okay? So anyway, that will round out most of my talk on this. I may do a supplementary, because I didn't really look too much at my lecture notes. I was just going off the whiteboard here. But hopefully that helps to sketch in an understanding of shooting an elephant and places to look to begin your final paper. So thank you.